Hello Internet, I'm Jackie Fox, and today we're going to talk about some midterm election takeaways. For people especially who don't pay a lot of attention to elections and a lot of the more in-depth coverage, this is going to be kind of a summary of some of the top line takeaways from all of it. And at least part of it, and one thing that I want to emphasize that's been changing about politics, and one of the things that I want to get into in this video is that Trump brought a lot of new voters into American politics in 2016. He basically took this group that wasn't considered likely voters and motivated them to vote for him. And because of that, pollsters kind of realized that these people who typically weren't taking polls were being underrepresented in polling, and they've been kind of shifting their numbers to account for this, which may in part be an overestimation that accounts for the rumored red wave that was supposed to happen. And in terms of the Republicans winning a ton of seats in this big red massacre, that didn't happen. But there is also evidence to say that the red wave actually did happen, that everything that they generally expected, even with that overestimation, did happen. The thing is, there was a whole nother group of unlikely voters that stepped in, the youth vote, which has long been considered incredibly unlikely voters. Just basically, we get the smallest sample size in most surveys. Our opinions aren't weighted very heavily in the American political discourse because historically, young folks haven't voted. But the Zoomers are definitely changing that, and I think that that has a big importance to everything moving forward. But also, looking at this kind of from a big picture before we zoom in on this midterm, it's kind of been the case that neoliberalism has crumbled the fastest as these new voters are brought into the mix. And in understanding how pollsters kind of figure out who's a likely voter in order to determine who will likely vote and how in a political outcome, that also heavily depends on things, roughly staying the same. So when you keep adding in new populations of voters, because, Donald Trump had a huge swell of support in 2016, and an even huger swell of support going into 2020. And while that is worth giving him credit for, at the same time, he also, in some ways, also compelled an even greater swell, setting records both for the person to win in a presidential election, and also the person to lose in a presidential election. And that number, the number that Trump lost by in that election, was still higher than any other president that had ever won before. So, we tend to vote most in presidential elections. So when you blast out the records in a presidential elections, and you have most certainly blown out voter participation records tremendously. So my point is that pollsters are trying to adapt the way that they look at polling and what they emphasize based on who they think will vote. And we have had increasingly large groups of new voters entering the fray. So let's get into what that means and what that meant in the midterm. So the red wave happened, as I said, but the youth vote more than countered it, at least overall. Why did the polling fail? Why did the polling that predicted the red wave fail? Well, in part, it's because of the overestimation of the low Republican response rate, because of the issues in polling that were highlighted between 2016 and 2020. Also, pollsters counted much of the youth as unlikely voters, as they traditionally have, as I just mentioned. Whether this implies that the overstated Republican numbers or not, this election had an unprecedented youth turnout, and the youth are largely more progressive than America as a whole, so this was a pretty big win for the Democrats. In several key races that caused major upsets of expected votes, often it was either by supporting progressives or completely abandoning moderates and kind of leaving them to the red wave. Though, on the whole, the youth vote influx does favor the Democratic Party, it is a very far cry from the mantra of vote blue no matter who. Therefore, the major beneficiaries of the youth wave are the progressive Democrats. This same wave missed the corporatists like the DCCC chairman who, stole the easiest possible district from a more progressive challenger, giving him a district he didn't think could be won instead. And the progressive wins, and he, in a district where he, his party should have had like a +10 advantage or something, he got stomped for being just a boring, run-of-the-mill corporatist politician that us young folks see right through and absolutely despise. So, the red wave smacked him in the face and knocked him off his feet. But in a nearby district, a progressive candidate actually got through even when they were the underdog. A lot of thought has been put into how the underperformance of the Republican Party has affected them. Mainly in how so many of them have begun to distance themselves from Donald Trump. But I actually find it far more interesting what this says about the hopeful future of Democratic politics. In this cycle, we saw Republicans run without plans or proposals, and yet they were formidable everywhere this youth wave didn't touch. In fact, picking up a lot of minority support that they previously weren't known for, like even among women, even though, abortion was a motivating factor in this election. I think the youth getting involved was more important than that, even though there were places where Republicans actually saw more female voters. Very strange. It seems to suggest that the youth vote can be a strong bulwark against traditional conservatism and the kind of boomer conservative voters who are very regularly going to the polls, the kind of people who are going to be there every election, the kind of people who are so consistent in voting for conservatives that they're ultimately why turnout determines elections, because they're going to show up either way. So if enough people don't show up to outvote them, they're going to win, essentially. But this bulwark is something that not only the Dems, but that third parties need. I mean, really, this could become a question of who actually appeals to the youth vote is the only person who can be politically competitive or politically viable. And if there are spaces in this country where the Democrats are not willing to hold up that mantle and want to keep running the same kind of boring corporatist politicians that we are so sick of, then a third party definitely has room to run someone who's actually progressive and pick up some votes there. But, and this is crucial, you have to do things. You have to speak to them. You have to speak to them. You have to speak to the issues that are actually important to them, not the ones that you think are important to them, not the ones that you read are important to them. You should probably talk to them about their lives. Because they're not the loyal partisans that earlier generations were. If you don't excite a youth voter, they don't vote. I hope that this mercuriality and their importance as a voting bloc will only grow, and that this will force candidates to actually do something for the voters for a change. Because if they don't, I think we're kind of happy to stay home. In several of my recent videos, I've talked about the political failure of the previous political order, and how the only real new political upswell or alternative, for better or for worse, was previously the one surrounding Donald Trump. But this election refutes the staying power of such a notion, as Trumpism seems to have fallen like a facade overnight. Like, just everyone kind of dropped Trump the day after the primary results came in. It was, and I mean everyone from like the propagandists to the people on the news to even like random conservatives that I overheard in a coffee shop this week. They're all just so sick of him now. And they don't, they not only don't see him as the future of the party, but they actually see his brand as being toxic. Like, it's like a switch just flipped in their brains over the night of the primary somehow. But perhaps more importantly, it demonstrates a viable and repeatable political strategy that need not appeal to absolute lunacy the way all of the crazy Trump copycats have tried to. And it also shows that you know, Trump himself is kind of an aberration, that strategy doesn't necessarily work for everyone because it wasn't very replicable in the 2022 primaries. And this new strategy is simple. Listen to the youth. Talk to them. See them for perhaps the first time as likely voters worth counting. And finally, this is likely to have an effect on future polling and poll results. As I noted earlier, just like how pollsters emphasized Trump voters in polling for years to try to account for their decreased likelihood of responding to polls, but their increased likelihood to vote, pollsters will now in the future more heavily sample youth voters, as they are now likely to be considered more likely to vote. And as politicians guide their campaigns by the poll results of likely voters, youth interests will be more likely to be seriously considered and now advocated for. I don't think that this is going to change the political landscape overnight. I think that there needs to be a couple more victories to really reinforce the idea that this is the way forward, but also maybe to cycle out some people within Congress over the next couple of elections so that we really kind of liven the place up. But I do think that this is incredibly promising and demonstrates that, you know, a coordinated and selective youth vote could be incredibly powerful in shaping the way that politicians go about campaigning. I mean, I remember it's strange how quickly this stuff can happen overnight. I remember when Bernie was going up against Hillary in the primaries, and it looked like he was doing really good. He actually looked like a serious contender. Or maybe this was when he was... No, I think this was when he was running in the big primary, the second one, that Biden ultimately won in 2020. And there was a moment where, like, you could see MSNBC making this calculation, and then all of a sudden, they started to be a lot more supportive of, like, Bernie-esque stuff, of progressive stuff for about a week. And then the South Carolina votes came in, and, like, that Super Tuesday, I think, all of that stuff came in. And then all of a sudden, they were like, okay, cool. We can drop that bullshit. Oh, man. But, like, it just shows that if a progressive was able to get into the right place and demonstrate that they could win, we could see a massive shift in what politicians believe is politically viable, is politically possible overnight. That shift could ripple throughout just everything, you know, all of a sudden. And we saw this happen with Trump. Like, we saw how Trump winning forced, for better or for worse, like, the media, the government, everyone to reconcile with the fact that somehow or another this crazy bastard had had the winning strategy. And we saw sycophants sucking up to him and shamelessly copying his act, hoping that it was a brilliant strategy that they could repeat. And, you know, it kind of worked while he was in office I guess maybe he had more political power to help them out. Maybe he wasn't taking 90% of the donations for himself like he is recently for Herschel Walker. But for whatever reason, there was actually a time when there was some viability to this strategy, even though I think the consensus post midterms has suddenly become that pretty much the only person this shit's working for is, well, people, I did overhear people saying Carrie Lake until she lost her race, until that was decided, and now it's pretty much just Ron DeSantis. It's the only that's the only person that anyone can see actually having a viable way forward for the Republican Party. And it really isn't anything original. It's again the same tired lack of idea and culture war narrative. It's again just that he has the right personality and a less tarnished record than Donald Trump, right now. And it really just shows you how much, well, this specifically shows you how much all of these people are absolutely just fake, just ready to ride any wave of any ideology that is popular for their team. They are partisans. And whatever the party supports, they support. And if that changes overnight, they change overnight. Which actually gives us a tremendous amount of potential to completely revolutionize the way that the Democratic Party operates. Because obviously they would have to change a lot of how they operate in order to appeal to the youth vote. And they're not going to elect to be socialist or whatever, because we tend to be a lot more left in that respect. But I do think that it is definitely going to potentially show, and I think one of the strongest things, if the Democratic Party does only one thing to reinforce their dominance with this youth vote bloc that could bring them the next couple of elections, do something about the fucking climate, okay? Because we are distinctly aware that a lot of you are going to be dead before any of this becomes such a major problem that it encumbers us here in the imperial core. We get that. But we do not have that privilege. Some of us are going to be underwater even here, before the end of our lifetime. So we want this issue taken seriously, and I can see, and it's not fucking pandering, it is a smart strategy to appeal to my generation and the generation below it, and even the generation coming up that will be voting in 2, 4, or even 6 years. If they see you giving a shit about the climate right now in their formative years when it matters, that is going to matter to them for decades. That could just determine their political alignment for a while. And even if that's all it does, even if that's really the big change, we could do a lot worse. And while it might not be the change that some in my audience ultimately want, it is a step in the right direction. You have to admit that. And incredibly, it feels like a lot more than it was easy to hope for previously. I mean, of course, I hoped for it previously because I believe in the power of having a dream and speaking it out loud. But at the same time, it's like there wasn't that much evidence that I could pull from reality to support it. But it feels like just the way that the midterm happened, everything about the way that this story built up was perfectly designed to teach us this lesson. So I actually hope we learn it this time. Thank you for tuning in. If you appreciate my thoughts on all of this complex political bullshit, if you think I actually managed to break it down and keep it simple and summarize a bunch of 10, 20-minute videos that you just don't have the time to watch, then show your appreciation with a like, a subscribe, a comment down in the comment place. There's going to be some cool stuff in the description. Links that you can send money to support the channel. There's also a link to a book that I just got done editing and really getting into a nice condition. I really want people to check this out. It is the entry into a whole metaverse of stories that I am working on getting through the editing process right now. And this one was based on a tabletop RPG campaign. So it has an interesting story, and it kind of rides the line between some of those murder hobo-y tropes. But I also tried to kind of push people into, like, what would you do to change the world other than killing a bunch of soldiers that I've put in your way? How else could you solve these problems? And, I think that makes it interesting. But, of course I like my own work. If I didn't, I wouldn't have written it, right? So you check it out. Tell me what you think. That's also going to be in the description. And you know what? Thank you so much for your support. I hope you have a wonderful day. See ya!